I have a confession to make about envy, and the solution just might surprise you.
If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these three key aims. If you're a parent, you'll also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Life's Key 3 podcast. I am delighted that you are here. And when this episode originally airs, it will be in early October. And here in the Midwest of the United States, that means change is in the air, literally, as leaves are leaving the trees and they are changing colors and falling to the ground. And, can I say, piling up way too quickly around my yard in places where I don't want them to be. And this means pulling out the rake, not just once or twice, but numerous times. And it also means sometimes there's a big part of the yard that is so filled with leaves, there's no way it's going to get raked up. Instead, it just gets run over with the lawnmower and they are crunched into mulch. Now, I know that every place that is listening to this doesn't necessarily have the 4 seasons like we have here in the Midwest, and you might not live in an area where this change is happening. But if there's one constant in life, no matter where you live, no matter your age, your profession, your social or economic standing, it is change. Yeah, the one constant is change. Sometimes it comes quite rapidly, and sometimes it occurs more in microbursts that don't appear too obvious at the beginning, but over a period of time, a person looks back and says, "Oh, wow," or "Oh, wow," whether that was a good change or a negative one. Well, I spotted one of those latter changes in my attitude a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, it wasn't one of those golden ones. It was one of those yucky ones. And over a couple of days, I just found myself numerous times in very small ways, in very tiny little ways, where I would come across something, I would hear something, I would think about something, might be in response to a podcast I was listening to, or an audiobook, or a piece of information, or something that came through on a text from a friend or family member or a social media post. And what I noticed was happening in my heart were these little falls of envy. It's like these crunchy brown leaves. Now, I love the bright red and orange and yellow leaves, but sometimes the trees just turn brown and they just drop, and there's really nothing terribly spectacular about them. They're just a bunch of brown dead leaves. And what I began to notice was what was dropping from my heart wasn't this bright gold and yellow and reds. It was just this ugly, blah, brown, dried up thoughts that really were envy. Now, this wasn't over some big thing. It wasn't like a friend or a family member won a huge contest or bought a new yacht or boat or even like a gorgeous new pair of shoes. I mean, it wasn't anything specific like that I could point to and say, "Oh, I'm envious of that event or that purchase." Rather, it was in these tiny little ways that I began to notice this bit of envy, and what clued me into this envy was having a little bit of a cynical response to something good and positive that I heard. It's where I found myself internally thinking something like, well, must be nice. Or, "Oh, good for them, but I really don't want to hear more about that. Let's just move on." And just different thoughts like this that were popping into my head. And after a couple of days of this happening, I began to go, okay, what is going on here? Because this is not good. This is not right. And rather than trying to shame myself into hiding what was going on in my heart, I got curious. We've talked about the importance of curiosity before, especially in relationships. Well, it's not just true that curiosity is a superpower when it comes to our relationship with others, it is a superpower when it comes to our relationship with ourselves. I could have just said to myself, Stephanie, just stop it. You know that's wrong. You need to just confess that of sin. You need to ask God to forgive you, and you need to just stop it. And I probably could have for a little while, but it wasn't going to change what was going on in my heart. And so instead of doing that, I began to go, okay, what's really going on here? And I began to pray about, say, God, what's going on in my heart? Why are these thoughts coming up, not just randomly once or twice, but why is my heart responding the way that it is? And a couple of days later, as I was reading one of the books that I read every morning, just a short page, it's Bob Goff's book, Catching Whimsy, 365 Days of Possibility, which I recommend. I read about the section where that's titled, God Goes Beyond Your Imagination. And he writes in the beginning about how as kids, we have these imaginations, and depending on what age we were, what time period that we grew up in, or our environment and all of that, what we hoped for, what we dreamt of that was going to be possible in our life was different. But as kids, they usually have these big dreams. They have these imaginations. I'm going to be an astronaut. I am going to be an amazing dancer. I mean, whatever it is, that changes over time, whether it's an athlete, it's a writer. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to cure a world disease. Kids have all kinds of things. Sometimes if they're young enough, it's like things like I'm going to be an amazing Tyrannosaurus Rex. And that's when you just realize there is value in the imagination, even when it's like, yeah, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be an amazing dinosaur. To which we say, oh, I bet you are. And then we go on. But then Bob goes on and he writes and he says, then you grew up and maybe what you started imagining was a car that didn't stall on the freeway, or what it would be like to pay less taxes or have fewer deductions taken out of your paychecks. And he asked this question, when did we start replacing whimsy with what adults like to call reason? And then he has this statement, and it just spoke to me as part of an answer to my question about why was envy showing up so much in these little ways in my heart. I wonder if we started imagining less because we feared that God wouldn't be able to deliver on our dreams. Maybe we learned to be reasonable with our expectations and hopes and more practical with our wants. Or perhaps we felt like if we imagined too much and asked God for it, it would make him look bad if it didn't come together. And that is when I realized that what was really at the heart of my envy wasn't because I wanted other people's relationships or stuff or whatever. It was because I had stopped asking God for too much in my own life. I had started moving into this mindset that God wasn't really going to deliver on my dreams. So the solution was to dream smaller, to dream less. Now, to be clear, it's not like I woke up one day and had this big dialogue with myself and came to this logical conclusion that said, here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to start asking less of God. No. That's not how these things occur in our lives. I began to pay attention to these little bitty seeds of envy. Okay, sorry, I know I'm switching analogies. For a minute ago, it was brown leaves falling, and I'm talking about seeds, but y'all are smart. Stick with me. The reason that I was paying attention to these little notices of envy that I found that were popping up in my heart is because everything grows if it is given nurturing, if it's given space, if we allow something to come into our heart and we just leave it there, by default, it will grow. And if we don't want it to grow, then we have to do the work of taking that out of our heart, or more appropriately, bringing that to God and asking Him to remove that from our heart. But we have to do some work here. And the connection between the fact that I had stopped asking God for too terribly much actually turned my attention more away from my own life and what I was asking God for and how I was showing up in life. And it started turning my attention looking over more to other people's lives. And then we get into, or for me, what I got into in a very subtle way was this micro comparison. And you know how it's interesting that when we do this negative type of comparison, and by the way, all comparison is not bad. Comparison itself can be a tremendously beneficial skill set that we develop in our life. But the negative use of comparison is when it leads to things like envy. And as I began to ask myself, okay, so why then am I asking God for less? Why have I taken my imagination, my holy imagination, and shrunk it down to be something very small, kind of like one of those containers that you suck all out of the air out of? And say you have a packing cube and it starts and it's 12 inches wide by 15 inches wide by 3 inches high, and then you attach a vacuum to it and then it sucks all of the air out, and now all of a sudden you've got this packing cube that's like 6 by 4 by half an inch high. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. Well, our packing cubes don't need air, but we do. And the air is not just the air that we breathe through our nose or our mouths. It's the air of imagination. It's the air of hope. It is the air of belief that there is good and beauty and purpose in this life. And one of the dark sides of self-awareness, if we allow it to be, here again, we have a choice about what we do with this, because the solution isn't, I'm just not going to be self-aware. That will always end up doing more harm than good over the long haul. It was good that I was self-aware. It was good that I was paying attention to these little tiny thoughts that kept popping up in my heart. There wasn't some big grand moment where all of a sudden something slapped me in the face, or I said something that was so unkind, or I thought something that was so terrible that all of a sudden I had this collision with envy that I went, whoa, man, I got this terrible problem with envy. It wasn't anything like that happened. It was these little bitty, very short, rather fleeting sometimes, thoughts and responses of my heart to something. But I knew enough to say, I need to pay attention to this, and especially when there was more than one that occurred over a short period of time. And so that self-awareness led me to go, what's really going on here? And then because that was in my mind, and I didn't have an answer on those days when this was happening, but I knew to take it to God and to say, God, I want you to show me what's going on in my life. And because I had that perspective in mind and I was looking for an answer, then when I read this particular devotion out of Bob Goff's book, it was able to speak to me in a way that had I not been paying attention about these little envious seeds or leaves or whatever, then I would not have read this the same way. And I realized I am asking God for too little. Why is that? What's happened? And there's different layers to that, but one of the answers that I had, and you might be in this situation too, and that is because when you live aware of the reality of this world, when you live in touch with what really matters, you are going to be in touch with suffering. You just can't escape it. There's painful things that happen to people that you love. And whether those are painful things that occur because of people's choices or they're pain that occur totally independent because of people's choices. You will be in touch with suffering if you are a self-aware, alert person who wants to live a life of meaning and purpose. You just don't get to live this life of being in touch and attuned with the reality of this world and be totally detached from suffering. I wish it was different. Hey, if there was a plan in place, if there was a way that could allow us to be fully attuned to what matters and what's important and what our needs are and other people's needs, and we never had to go near suffering, but I would sign up for that plan in a moment. Not only with that, I would give it to you. I wouldn't even sell it to you. I would just give it to you. But that is not the way that the world works. And as we are in touch with the suffering that is happening, whether it is with those people that are near and dear to us, whether it's just the suffering that we are exposed to around the world, one of the casualties of that attunement can be our hope. It can be our imagination. We can become not only envious, but we can become cynical. And both of those lead to a callousness. And a callousness, when it forms on a part of our body, it can create a certain level of protection, but it also removes the sensation of tenderness. And so what's the solution to this? It is continuing to ask God for big things. It is continuing to have an imagination that believes that God is who He said He is, that He is able to do far more than we can ask or think or even imagine. And so He wants us to ask Him for big things. And by big things, I'm not just talking about stuff. I'm talking about big things in terms of our giftings and our opportunities and our impact. That is, and our growth and our character development. And the more that we are looking forward in anticipation to what God may do, the less focused that we are on what's happening with those around us, not in a bad way, but in a way that we're not looking around so that we get distracted by envy and that we don't get defeated by cynicism. Yes, there's suffering. Yes, there is an abundance of hard stuff in this world. And sometimes it feels like it's just going to squeeze the life right out of you. And I was having a conversation with one of my sons yesterday, and we were talking about Jesus on the cross and the suffering. And I reminded him of the verse that talks about that Jesus endured the cross, despising the shame. Why? For the joy that was set before him. Jesus didn't endure the cross because he needed to prove that he had some great endurance skill. He didn't endure the agony and the shame of the cross because he needed to prove he had grit. It wasn't the end. It was a means to an end. And he was able to endure because he had something beyond the endurance, and that was the joy of what his endurance was accomplishing. And sometimes we can get caught up as Christians in thinking that endurance and grit is just kind of the mean. It's not the means to the end. It's like the end. We just have to prove that we have endurance, that we have stamina, that we have grit, and we forget joy. We forget to look forward with anticipation. We forget to have hope and an imagination. And God is reminding us and calling us back to say, it's for the joy set before you that we live in this world, fully attuned to the suffering of the world, and yet not being consumed by it. You can be totally attuned to the pain of this world and not be undone by it, to not be consumed by it. But the only way you're going to do that, be able to do that on a sustainable level, is when you fight to hold on to that childish, in a good way, childlike imagination that believes that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we can ask or imagine. Well, that's going to wrap us up for today. I hope that this has been helpful to you and that you file this away. Maybe it's not something you need right now, but you file it away because it might be something you want to pull out in the future for you or to help a friend. And speaking of friends, I'm going to ask you again, share this podcast with a friend. Leave a rating and review. Those are very much appreciated, and they really help me to know what's resonating with you, the listeners. And if you haven't already, go to the website, stephaniepresents.com, sign up for my weekly newsletter. And most of all, my friend, I want you to remember this truth and live like it's true because it is. You have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable. I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for High Impact to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.